23-year-old shy waitress made a silent signal to the Mafia boss. What happened next shocked everyone. She poured his coffee with a knife pressed against her ribs, and smiled anyway. That smile saved his life. It destroyed hers. 23-year-old Raina Voss had no business knowing what she knew. No business doing what she did, and absolutely no business surviving what came next. But some secrets don't stay buried, and some daughters don't stay invisible. If stories like this keep you up at night, subscribe to this channel right now, and ring that notification bell. Now let's go. The Ivory Salt wasn't the kind of place that advertised. No sign above the door, no listing in any directory, no social media presence of any kind. You either knew where it was, or you didn't. And if you didn't, that was entirely by design. It occupied the entire ground floor of a converted textile building in the oldest quarter of the city, where the streets were narrow and the shadows pooled early. Inside, everything was dark wood and low candlelight, the kind of atmosphere that made dangerous men feel powerful and invisible at the same time. The staff were trained to be furniture present, functional, and completely forgettable. Raina Voss had mastered forgettable. She was 23, slight, with dark eyes that took in far more than she ever let on, and a quietness about her that people consistently mistook for timidity. She had worked the floor of the Ivory Salt for 7 months, navigating the tables with the careful efficiency of someone who understood that in a room full of powerful men, invisibility was its own kind of armor. She didn't ask questions. She didn't linger. She poured, she smiled, she disappeared, and she collected her tips at the end of the night without fanfare. It was a system that worked perfectly, until the night it didn't. She knew something was wrong before the door even opened. It was the energy, a sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, the way conversations dropped half a register, and backs straightened almost imperceptibly. Raina was behind the service counter, refilling a tray, when the entrance swung open, and Killian Ashcroft walked in like the room had been waiting for him, without knowing it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit like a second skin, with a face that was all sharp angles and controlled expression. He moved through the room with the particular stillness of someone who had never once in his life needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted. Behind him came 2 men, both large, both scanning the room with the practiced sweep of people whose entire job was anticipating catastrophe. Raina knew the name Killian Ashcroft, the way everyone in this city knew it, carefully, and from a safe distance. He controlled the eastern trade corridors, the port authorities, 3 city council members, and the kind of silence that money buys around inconvenient truths. He was not a man you looked at directly. He was not a man you remembered seeing. And he was absolutely not a man you brought attention to yourself around. Raina picked up her tray and moved to table 9. She wasn't assigned to table 9. Table 9 belonged to Faye, who was currently occupied across the room. But something pulled Raina there, some quiet, insistent instinct that she had learned years ago not to argue with. She approached with her head down, the professional neutrality she wore like a uniform firmly in place. She set down the water glasses. She reached for the candle to adjust it, and that was when she saw it, the reflection. The silver surface of the drinks tray caught it perfectly, a pinpoint of red light, steady and deliberate, moving in a slow arc across the back wall before settling. Raina's eyes tracked it without moving her head. She followed the geometry of it in the reflection, calculating the angle, the origin point, the destination. It was coming through the narrow gap of the side window, the one that looked out onto the service alley, and it was resting, with terrible patience, on the back of Killian Ashcroft's head. Everything in Raina's body went quiet. Not the quiet of fear, the quiet of something older than fear, something that lived below thought and below instinct, in the deepest layer of who she was. Her hands didn't shake, her breath didn't catch. She straightened up from the candle, turned smoothly toward Cillian's table, and walked to it with the unhurried confidence of someone simply doing her job. She set the tray down at a precise angle on the table beside him, an angle that placed the silver surface directly between the window and the back of his head, breaking the laser's line of sight. Then she leaned forward to adjust his glass, and she placed her left hand flat on the table. She tucked her thumb into her palm. She folded her fingers over it, and she tapped twice with her index finger against the dark wood. Tap, tap. The silence that followed lasted less than 2 seconds. Killian Ashcroft's eyes dropped to her hand. They stayed there for 1 heartbeat, and then they snapped up to her face with an expression she would spend a long time trying to describe afterward. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't suspicion. It was recognition, immediate and electric, chased immediately by something that looked almost like disbelief. He held her gaze for a fraction of a second that felt like a full minute. Then he moved. He didn't lunge. He didn't shout. He simply shifted his weight with fluid, practiced economy, rising from the chair, and stepping left in one motion that looked almost casual to anyone not watching closely. The shot came through the window, a half-second later, a suppressed crack that buried itself in the high-backed chair where his head had been, sending a shower of upholstery into the candlelight. The room detonated. Screaming, overturned chairs, the thunder of his 2 lieutenants, drawing weapons and swarming the window. The lights went out. Someone hit the floor hard. Glass broke somewhere behind the bar. Raina stood completely still in the middle of it. A hand closed around her wrist, firm, not rough, and she was moving before she made the decision to move. Pulled through the swinging kitchen door and into the harsh fluorescent light of the back corridor. Cillian Ashcroft didn't look at her as he pulled her through the kitchen and out the rear exit into the alley, his lieutenants flanking them with weapons drawn. The cold night air hit her face. A black car materialized from the darkness, engine already running. The door opened. He guided her in with a hand at her back that somehow managed to be both commanding and careful. The door closed. The car moved. The city blurred past the tinted windows. Cillian sat beside her, perfectly composed, studying her face in the way that a man studies something he cannot categorize. His lieutenants were in the front, silent and professional. Nobody spoke for a long time. Raina watched the streetlights scroll past and tried to locate the feeling she was supposed to be feeling. Terror, probably, or at minimum a reasonable level of distress. But all she found was a strange humming stillness, like the inside of her had gone somewhere quiet, to wait. "Your name," Cillian said finally. His voice was low, unhurried, and carried the particular weight of someone who asked questions exactly once. "Raina Voss," she said. He studied her for another long moment. Outside, the city gave way to wider roads, darker trees, and the kind of wealth that hides itself behind high stone walls and older money. His expression hadn't changed, but something behind his eyes had a calculation running, a conclusion forming, something he wasn't ready to say out loud yet. "You're going to want to explain that signal," he said quietly. Raina looked at him. She looked at the hands folded in her lap. She looked back up. "I don't know how to," she said. And that was the truth, the most frightening truth she had ever told. Because the signal had come out of her, the way breathing came out of her, without thought, without choice, without any conscious knowledge of what it meant, or where it had come from. It had simply been there, waiting, like it had been there her entire life. Like it had been put there. The car turned through iron gates and moved up a long, dark drive, toward a building that was less a house and more a statement. Lights swept the grounds. Guards moved at the perimeter. Cillian stepped out first and turned back to offer his hand, not as a courtesy, but as an instruction. Raina took it. She stepped out into the cold air and looked up at the fortress in front of her. Whatever she had been before tonight was already gone. She just didn't know it yet. Cillian Ashcroft's compound didn't feel like a home. It felt like a held breath. Every corridor was clean, precise, and deliberately cold, the kind of place where warmth had been engineered out of the architecture. Raina was shown to a room in the east wing by a maid who said nothing and made no eye contact. The room was immaculate. Heavy drapes, a bed that probably cost more than 6 months of her rent, and a lock on the outside of the door that clicked the moment the maid left. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her own hands. The signal. She kept returning to it, the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't stop. She hadn't thought about it. She hadn't decided. It had simply moved through her like a current, from somewhere she couldn't name, bypassing every conscious layer of her mind, and arriving in her hands fully formed. 2 taps, thumb tucked, index finger down, like she had done it 1,000 times. Like someone had made her practice until it lived in her bones. The door unlocked at 8 in the morning. It wasn't a maid. The woman who entered was compact, angular, with close-cropped silver hair and eyes the color of wet slate. She carried a tray of food and set it on the dresser without ceremony. Her name, Raina would learn, was Greta. Cillian's enforcer, responsible for the compound's internal security, and quite possibly the most watchful human being Raina had ever encountered. Greta stood near the door with her arms crossed, and studied Raina the way a jeweler studies a stone of uncertain origin, looking for flaws, looking for fraud. "He wants you downstairs in 20 minutes, Greta said. "Eat something first. You'll need it." The room where Cillian was waiting was stripped of everything decorative, a long table, 2 chairs, a single overhead light. He was already seated when Raina entered, a closed folder in front of him, and a stillness about him that felt less like patience and more like compression. He gestured to the chair across from him. Raina sat. "The signal you used last night," Cillian said, opening the folder, "was a dead communication code. It belonged to a closed intelligence cell that operated inside this organization 19 years ago." He looked up. That cell had 4 members, all 4 confirmed dead. The code was never written down, never recorded, never shared outside those 4 people. He held her gaze. "So explain to me how a waitress used it instinctively in a crisis." "I don't know," Raina said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." She pressed her palms flat against the table. "It came out of me. I didn't think about it. I don't know what it means or where it's from." Cillian studied her face for a long time. "Tell me about your mother." The shift caught her off guard. "She died when I was 9. Highway accident. The records say she was a primary school teacher. We moved around a lot." She was quiet. Raina paused, something cold moving through her chest. "She used to play games with me in restaurants, made me watch the room, count exits, track where people's hands were. She said it was a concentration exercise." She stopped. "She taught me to watch reflections." Cillian reached into the folder and slid a photograph across the table. Grainy, black and white, taken somewhere that didn't want to be documented. Two people in tactical gear against a concrete wall. One was a younger Cillian. The other was a woman with dark eyes and ink-stained fingers, and a quietness that Raina recognized the way you recognize your own reflection. Her mother, unmistakably. That was taken 20 years ago, Cillian said quietly. Your mother built the internal communications architecture for this entire organization. She designed the signal system. She was the most technically brilliant person this operation ever had. He paused. She disappeared 19 years ago. Someone inside these walls ordered it. Someone who knew she had discovered something she was never supposed to find. Raina couldn't speak. The woman in the photograph was holding a coffee cup with both hands. The way she always had. The way Raina always did. She didn't die in a highway accident, Cillian continued. She was erased. And I believe that before she disappeared, she spent 9 years turning you into a contingency plan. She hid something, Raina, something that someone in this building has been terrified of for 2 decades. And she hid it in you. The silence that followed was enormous. Raina looked at the photograph. She thought about the games in restaurants, the watching, the counting, the signals that had lived in her body like a second skeleton her whole life, without her ever knowing what they were for. Her mother's voice, quiet and steady, asterisk if you can't speak, let your hands remember. She had thought it was a quirk, a dead woman's way of making their difficult, transient life feel like something other than survival. It wasn't any of those things. What did she find? Raina asked. Cillian's jaw tightened. That's what we need to figure out. Before whoever ordered her erasure figures out that you're here. He closed the folder. Because they're already inside these walls. They've been here the whole time. And last night's shooter wasn't sent for me. He held her gaze, unflinching. They were sent for you. The days inside the compound had a particular texture, controlled, watchful, and suffocating in the way that only safety can be when it isn't chosen. Raina moved through them carefully, learning the rhythms of the place the way she had always learned rooms, quietly, completely, without letting anyone know she was doing it. She knew which guards rotated at which hours. She knew that Greta took her coffee at the kitchen counter every morning at 7, and didn't speak to anyone until she'd finished it. She knew that Cillian worked until past midnight in his study, and that the light under his door was the last one to go dark in the entire building. And she knew that Cillian Broadbury was always watching her. Cale was Cillian's most trusted advisor, had been for 12 years by all accounts. He was lean, somewhere in his mid-40s, with warm brown eyes, and the kind of easy smile that made people feel immediately at ease. He was the only person in the compound who had been consistently kind to her since her arrival. He brought her books without being asked. He explained the compound's routines, so she wouldn't feel disoriented. He asked about her life before the ivory salt, with what seemed like genuine curiosity, listening carefully and remembering details. He felt, in a place full of hard edges, like the one soft thing. That was precisely what bothered her. She couldn't have explained it in words. It was more a frequency she picked up on, something that hummed just below the surface of every interaction with him. His warmth was real, but his attention was too precise. His questions were kind, but they always, eventually, circled back to the same territory. Her childhood, her mother, her earliest memories. He never pushed, he never pressed, but he always returned, gently, like water finding its level. Raina said nothing about it. She smiled, answered selectively, and watched his hands. The second attempt came on a Thursday evening. The power died compound-wide, at 9:40, plunging every corridor into the amber glow of emergency lighting. Raina was in the library on the second floor when it happened, a room she had claimed as her own over the past week, drawn to it by some instinct she didn't question. She heard Greta's voice somewhere below, sharp and commanding, directing the security team to the perimeter. Footsteps moved fast through the corridors. The compound shifted into its crisis posture, with the efficiency of something that had been rehearsed. Then the library door opened. It wasn't Greta. It wasn't Cillian. The man who stepped through the door was one of the compound's interior guards, someone she had seen every day, someone whose face she knew. And he was moving toward her with a purposefulness that had nothing to do with protection. Raina was already moving before he reached her, 3 years of her mother's instilled muscle memory firing simultaneously. She put the heavy reading table between them. He lunged. She used his momentum against him, stepping aside and driving her elbow into the back of his neck with a precision that she did not consciously know she possessed until the moment she used it. He went down hard. She stood over him, breathing carefully, and realized her hands weren't shaking. Cillian appeared in the doorway 40 seconds later, Greta directly behind him. He took in the scene, the man on the floor, Raina standing over him, composed, and something shifted in his expression that she couldn't fully read. Not surprise exactly, something more complicated than surprise. He came through the interior, Greta said, crouching to check the man's pulse. Not the perimeter. The breach was inside. Cillian looked at Raina. Are you hurt? No. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked at Greta. Lock it down. Nobody leaves. The interrogation of the guard took 2 hours. Raina wasn't in the room for it, but she heard enough through the walls to understand the shape of what was happening. The man had been paid well, paid recently, and paid through a channel so clean and so internal that it pointed directly at someone with deep organizational access. Cillian emerged from that room, looking like a man carrying something extraordinarily heavy just behind his eyes. That night, unable to sleep, Raina went through the jacket she had been wearing the night of the ivory assault, the one piece of clothing she had brought from her old life, everything else having been replaced by the compound's efficient wardrobe. She had worn it so long she had stopped feeling it, but something made her check the lining. A small deliberate irregularity in the stitching along the inner hem, the kind of thing that would be invisible unless you were looking for it, unless someone had taught you to look for it. She pulled the thread. The lining opened. Inside, folded to the size of a thumbnail, was a photograph. Old, slightly burned at one corner, but intact enough. Two people seated at a restaurant table, caught mid-conversation, neither of them aware of the camera. One of them was her mother, young, bright-eyed, leaning forward with the focused energy Raina remembered from childhood. The other was Cale Drury. Her blood went cold, not because they knew each other. People knew each other. That alone meant nothing. But the photograph was burned. Someone had tried to destroy it and failed. And her mother had found it, kept it, hidden it, and sewn it into a jacket she had given Raina the week before she disappeared, pressing it into her small hands with a quietness that Raina had mistaken for ordinary tenderness. It wasn't tenderness, it was evidence. She was still holding the photograph when her door opened without a knock. Cale stood in the doorway. He looked at the photograph in her hand. He looked at her face, and the warm brown eyes went very, very still in the way that warm things go still right before they stop pretending entirely. "You found it," he said softly, almost to himself. Raina didn't move. "You knew my mother." "I did." He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. His hand moved to his jacket and came back with a small flat weapon that he held without drama, without theater, simply and professionally. She was extraordinary. It was genuinely a shame. He tilted his head. "Where is it, Raina? What she hid? Your mother was too careful to leave a signal without leaving the rest of it. Where is it? I don't know what you're talking about." "You will tell me," Cale said, with the patience of someone who has never once needed to rush, "or I will go downstairs and put a bullet in Killian Ashcroft, and then come back up here and we can continue this conversation without the distraction of hoping he'll save you." The door behind him opened. Cillian stood in the frame, taking in the weapon, taking in Raina's face, taking in 12 years of trusted counsel, pointing a gun at a 23-year-old woman in his own compound. His expression didn't collapse. It hardened into something absolute and terrifying. Cale turned without hurry, keeping the weapon level. "Put it down, Killian," he said, "or she dies first. And we both know you won't let that happen." The silence stretched like a wire pulled to its absolute limit. Cillian looked at Raina. She looked back at him. And then, with a deliberateness that made her stomach drop completely, he reached into his jacket, removed his weapon, and set it on the floor. Cale smiled. It was the warmest smile she had ever seen on a human face. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever witnessed. The gun on the floor meant something different to every person in that room. To Cale it meant victory. To Raina, it meant the clock had started. And to Killian, standing in the doorway, with 12 years of betrayal crystallizing in real time behind his eyes, it meant that every instinct he had ever suppressed about the man in front of him had been correct, and that he had paid for ignoring them with everything that mattered. Cale gestured toward the corner of the room. "Both of you, sit down." Neither of them moved immediately. Cale's expression didn't change. That was the most frightening thing about him, Raina realized. He had no tells because he had no conflict. Whatever he had once been capable of feeling about the damage he caused had been quietly retired long ago, leaving behind something smooth and functional and completely empty at its center. "Cale," Killian said. His voice was extraordinarily controlled. 19 years. You've been inside this organization for 19 years. 22, Cale corrected, with the mild tone of someone fixing a minor factual error. "I was already embedded when your father ran things. Your father trusted me too." He paused. "It's a gift, I suppose. Being trustworthy." "You ordered her mother's death," Cillian said. "I protected an investment." Cale glanced at Raina without warmth. "Your mother was brilliant, genuinely brilliant. But she found the ledger. She found every name, every transaction, every buried arrangement going back 2 decades. I couldn't allow that to surface. I couldn't allow her to surface." His eyes moved back to Cillian. "I've been very patient since then, very careful. And then this girl walks into the ivory salt and uses a dead signal, like she was born knowing it, because she was, and suddenly 19 years of careful work is sitting on a knife's edge." "What ledger?" Raina asked. Cale looked at her with something approaching appreciation. "Your mother didn't just discover what I'd done. She documented everything. Every transaction I ran through the organization's accounts, every official I owned, every contract I brokered on both sides of the law simultaneously." He tilted his head. "She built a complete record, and then she hid it. And then she disappeared, before she could tell anyone where. I've spent 19 years looking for it." His eyes dropped briefly to the photograph still in her hand. "And I believe she hid it on you." Raina looked down at the photograph, then at her own hands, then somewhere further inward than either of those things, following a thread her mother had laid down 19 years ago, through games in restaurants and signals in her bones, and a jacket pressed into small hands with quiet, urgent love. Her hand moved to her throat. She had worn the locket since she was 9 years old. It had been the last thing her mother fastened around her neck the morning before she disappeared. Small, iron grey, utterly plain. The kind of thing nobody looked at twice. Raina had never been able to open it. The clasp was fused, or seemed to be, and she had stopped trying so long ago that she had forgotten it was anything other than decoration. She had forgotten, because she had been meant to forget, until the moment she was meant to remember. She pressed the back of the locket with her thumb. Then she pressed the front simultaneously, the way you'd press 2 keys at once, and felt something release inside it with a click so small it was nearly silent. It opened. Inside, pressed flat against the interior, was a sliver of microfilm no larger than her thumbnail. Kyle saw it. Every carefully maintained composure he possessed cracked open for exactly 1 second, a flash of something raw and desperate moving across his face, before the mask slammed back into place. He raised the weapon, and Raina dropped. Not in panic, in precision. She hit the floor and rolled left, putting the bed between herself and Cale's line of sight. The shot he fired went through empty air. Killian moved the instant the weapon shifted, crossing the room in 3 strides, driving his shoulder into Cale's chest, and slamming him into the wall, hard enough to shake the framed mirror loose. The weapon skittered across the floor. Cale was fast, faster than a man his age had any right to be, and he drove his knee upward, and his elbow down, and for a moment the two of them were locked in something vicious and wordless against the wall. Raina came up from behind the bed. She grabbed the weapon from the floor. She leveled it with both hands, and she found, to her own distant amazement, that they were perfectly steady. "Stop," she said. Her voice carried the particular quality of someone who does not need to raise it. Both men stopped. Cale had Cillian by the collar. Cillian had Cale by the throat. They held that position, breathing hard, and looked at her. She kept the weapon exactly where it was, and reached into her pocket with her free hand, removing her phone. She had memorized the number 3 days ago from a contact card she had found in the library. The direct line to the syndicate's ruling council. The body above even Killian. The 4 remaining family heads who had spent 2 decades wondering who had been bleeding their operations from the inside. She dialed. It rang twice. A voice answered, gravel deep and cautious. "My name is Raina Voss," she said. "My mother was your intelligence architect. I have the ledger she built 19 years ago. I have the name of the man who ordered her death, and has been running a parallel operation inside your organization since before most of your current lieutenants were recruited." She paused. "I also have him in this room. I suggest you send someone senior. Tonight." She ended the call. Cale looked at her with those warm brown eyes. For the first time since she had known him, the warmth reached all the way to the surface. Not because he felt it, but because there was nothing left to hide behind. Underneath it, he looked extraordinarily tired. Like a man who has been running a very long race, and has just understood, with complete finality, that the finish line isn't where he thought it was. "Your mother would be proud," he said. It sounded genuine. That made it worse. "Don't," Raina said quietly. 3 members of the council arrived within the hour. Greta let them in without a word, having read the room with the efficiency that made her indispensable. Cale was taken with a minimum of ceremony, and a maximum of finality. The microfilm was handed over. The ledger it contained was, according to the council's most senior member, a woman named Harrow, who had been in the organization longer than Raina had been alive. The single most comprehensive internal intelligence document any of them had ever seen. 20 years of everything, every name, every number, every buried truth. Her mother had built it in secret, over years, with the patience of someone who understood that the most dangerous things in the world are not weapons but records. When the council left, the compound went quiet, in a different way than it usually did. Not the held-breath quiet of controlled tension, but something older and more spacious, like a room after a window has been opened for the first time in years. Cillian found Raina in the library. She was sitting in the chair she had claimed as her own, the empty locket open in her palm, looking at the small, perfect space where something important had lived for 19 years without her knowing. He sat across from her, and said nothing for a while, which she had learned was one of the things about him she respected most. "She planned all of it," Raina said eventually. "Every game in every restaurant, every signal, the jacket, the locket. She knew she wasn't going to make it out. She knew the most she could do was make sure that when the time came, I would be ready without knowing I was ready." "She loved you," Cillian said. "She weaponized me," Raina said. Then quieter, "She loved me." Both things were true. She was learning to hold them simultaneously. Cillian leaned forward, his forearms on his knees, his eyes steady on her face. "You can leave," he said. "The threat is gone. Kyle is finished. The council owes you more than they will ever adequately express, and I will make sure you have everything you need to go back to whatever life you want to build." He paused. "I mean that. No obligation, no debt." Raina closed the locket in her palm. She looked at him for a long moment, reading the room the way her mother had taught her, watching hands, watching eyes, counting the exits, and then deciding, for the first time in her life, entirely by choice, not to take any of them. "I don't want to go back," she said. "There's nothing to go back to." She looked down at the locket, then back up. "She spent 19 years making sure I could survive this world. It seems like a waste not to." The corner of Cillian's mouth moved in a way she hadn't seen before. Raina Voss had walked into the ivory salt as furniture present, functional, forgettable. She walked out of this chapter of her life as something the underworld didn't have a clean word for yet. Not a boss, not an operative, something rarer than either. The daughter of the woman who had built the language of an empire, now fluent in every word of it, sitting in the library of a fortress that had just decided, without any formal announcement, that it belonged to her too. Some secrets don't stay buried, and some daughters don't stay invisible. If this story had you gripped from the first signal to the last, smash that like button right now. It means everything to this channel. Subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Share this with someone who loves a good underdog takeover. We'll see you in the next one.